The Indian Revolt of 1857-59, also called the Sepoy Mutiny, the Indian Mutiny, and referred to in India as their first war of independence, was the greatest challenge to British rule in India in the 19th century. It resulted in a series of bloody battles, massacres of civilians by Indian rebels, and vicious reprisals by the British. It cost tens of thousands of lives and resulted in the demise of the once mighty East India Company. It also threw up a series of fascinating people on both sides. One of the most incredible of them all was a warrior queen in her late 20s, who died leading her troops into battle. A woman who fans of Flashman and the Great Game will also recognise. So welcome to my fifth and final talk in my short series on this revolt. This is the story of the Rani of Jhansi. As I've talked about in my previous episodes, the Indian Revolt had many causes which came together in 1857. But there was a particular simmering resentment, which is the base of today's story. During the decade prior to the Rising, the East India Company had developed a neat trick for expanding their influence at the expense of India's many hereditary princely rulers. Now, adopting a child and naming him as your heir was not something that happened as a general rule in Europe, but it was not uncommon in India. However, using a policy called the Doctrine of Lapse, the East India Company refused to recognise successors to India's princely states if they had been adopted. In other words, if a ruler died and their heir was an adopted child, the British deemed that claim invalid, and the title had lapsed. And under those circumstances, they decreed that they should take over the state. During the decade running up to the revolt, the East India Company had invoked this doctrine nearly a dozen times to increase their direct rule on the subcontinent. One of those states that fell foul to this rule was the former Maratha state of Jhansi in central India. When the ageing Maharaja died in 1853, he had nominated his 3-year-old stepson, Damodar Rao, as his successor, with his wife ruling as regent during his minority. The East India Company, using their Doctrine of Lapse, refused to recognise the new ruler and took over direct control themselves. Hardly surprising, such a tactic was bound to create animosity. And it did in Jhansi, in the person of the young would-be ruler's stepmother and wife of the deceased Maharaja, Rani Lakshmibai. The British would come to rue the day that they had applied their doctrine to her state. Born in 1828, Rani Lakshmibai came from a noble family who had served the Maratha rulers in senior administrative roles. Her childhood was spent in the company of the children of the Maratha nobility, including the adopted son of the last emperor, Nana Sahib, who would play a leading role in the later revolt against the British. And also in this friendship circle was Tatya Tope, another name whom we've come across in previous episodes. Apart from more intellectual studies, the future Rani of Jhansi also excelled in pastimes that were traditionally seen as male preserves: riding, shooting and fencing, things that would serve her well in the future. When she was 14, she married the future and last Maharaja of Jhansi. He was twice her age. Their only child, a boy, died when he was just 4 months old, so the royal couple adopted the son of a cousin and named him Damodar Rao. And it was this boy who was the subject to that Doctrine of Lapse in 1853. Boy and stepmother were pensioned off by the East India Company, but Rani Lakshmibai seethed with anger. But how could a widowed queen and a 3-year-old boy realistically overturn the might of the East India Company? And there it might have ended, had it not been for events less than 4 years later. In early May 1857, sepoys at the military base at Meerut mutinied. They marched on nearby Delhi, where they were joined by many in the civilian population and took control of the city. Initially, everything remained quiet down in Jhansi, 270 miles away. Was the Rani biding her time? Was she actively planning to join the rising? We don't know. What we do know is that with the uncertainty sweeping across northern India, the Dowager Queen approached the local British superintendent, Captain Alexander Skene, asking for permission to raise a bodyguard. As superintendent, Captain Skene was responsible for administrating the area on behalf of the East India Company. Skene, who seemed to enjoy cordial relations with Lakshmibai, agreed. Indeed, he was so relaxed about the situation in Jhansi that he told his superiors they had nothing to worry about in this part of India. Why do people tempt fate like this? Because On the nights of the 5th and 6th of June, less than a month after that first mutiny at Meerut, members of the 12th Bengal Native Infantry and a whole squadron of the 14th Irregular Cavalry mutinied in Jhansi. So much for Skene's nothing to worry about. He now hastily ordered all the British officers plus their women, children, servants to take refuge in the fortress that commanded the city. For the next 2 days they held out, but hopelessly outnumbered. Skene accepted terms for surrender on the 8th of June. Before leaving the fortress, the British officer asked for an oath from the rebel soldiers and from the Rani that they would be given safe conduct. Supposedly, this was given. However, when the 18 men, 19 women, 19 children emerged, they were taken to an orchard and hacked to death with swords. Only one woman and her child survived, a certain Mrs. Mutlow, who, being Eurasian or Anglo-Indian, was mistaken by the attackers as a local supporter. The Rani's role in the massacre has been hotly debated ever since. Mrs. Mutlow, that survivor, claimed that the attackers were all former sepoys. In other words, the Rani's personal bodyguards were not involved. The Rani herself sent a letter to the British Commissioner, Major Erskine, vigorously claiming her innocence and stating that the mutineers were quite frankly a law unto themselves. Interestingly, the Rani had to use her bodyguard to face down the rebels who wanted to place a rival claimant on the throne instead of her son, so maybe she wasn't in league with them. But that initial outcome, the removal of the British control, certainly suited her aspirations to restore her stepson to the throne. So again, we will never truly know. After the recapture of Jhansi later that year, the British found possessions from the dead in her palace and argued that it proved her complicity. Others argue that these could have been gifts from the soldiers. On the other hand, considering that she knew the fate of the owners, they did seem like rather strange presents to keep. But who knows? Historian Saul David argued that in all likelihood the Rani was simply keeping her options open and waiting to see how the revolt would play out. That could be the case, as several other Indian rulers certainly played that game before determining which side to support. Some went with the rebels, some went with the British. 4 days later, the mutineers left the city, heading to join the rebellions in Delhi and Cawnpore. Rani Lakshmibai stepped into the power vacuum and offered to run the state until the British returned. Major Erskine happily accepted the offer, although the Governor-General of India, Lord Canning, was not so enthusiastic. By now, he had heard of the massacre, and he, along with many others on the British side, were far from convinced about her innocence. Already, she was being referred to as the Jezebel of India. In September, the Rani was faced by an invasion by 2 neighbouring pro-British princely states. However, it seemed that this invasion had little to do with the British, and a lot more to do with the 2 neighbouring rulers deciding to grab some territory whilst Jhansi was too weak to resist, and while the British were too preoccupied to prevent them. Faced with this invasion, she appealed to the British for armed support, only to be told that Jhansi was not at that precise moment a priority, and that no troops could be spared. Maybe this rejection by the British finally tipped the balance for the Rani. She could have felt betrayed by the people whom she had offered to help, despite their refusing to recognise the rights of her stepson. Maybe indeed she was only offering to hold the state for the British in order to get recognition for him as a reward. Now, it was apparent that they didn't give a hoot about her, Jhansi, or her son. Maybe the inability of the British to provide troops actually convinced the Rani and the anti-British faction in her court that the British days in India were numbered, and now was the time to openly support the revolt. It's unclear. But what was clear was that the invading army of the 2 Rajas had to be defeated, and they'll have to be defeated by Rani Lakshmibai and whatever army she could rustle up locally. She gathered over 10,000 local supporters, and together with 1,500 former sepoys and her Afghan bodyguard, marched on the invaders. By October she was victorious and had sent the invading Rajas packing. For the next 5 months she ruled Jhansi effectively independent from British control, although not officially participating in the revolt. Throughout the period into 1858 she procrastinated about whether to join the revolt. But procrastinating can only last so long. Eventually you have to make a decision, good or bad, or else the decision is made for you. And that was effectively what happened to the Rani. Advancing towards Jhansi from Bombay was a column of 3,000 British and Loyalist Indians under General Sir Henry Rose. At this stage, the city itself was not seen as a target by the British. It was merely en route to deal with the army of Tatya Tope, which whilst defeated at Cawnpore was still very much in the field. Arriving at Sagar, about 150 miles south of Jhansi, they lifted a siege by the rebels and were warmly greeted by the local population. Once more, as I've said throughout this series, not all of India was rebelling against the British. Now Rose heard that Tatya Tope was threatening the ruler of Badulla state, which was loyal to the British. He decided to head to Jhansi and secure the city before moving on to support Badulla. Rose covered an impressive 120 miles in 8 days through the jungles and rivers of central India, arriving outside Jhansi on the 21st of March, 1858. It must have given the Rani a sense of irony and some bitterness to see both the haste and the size of the British force heading to support Badulla, considering the zero support she had received when her own state was being threatened back in the autumn. And remember, at this stage, the Rani hadn't declared her hand. And that troubled General Rose. Here was a ruler accused of supporting a massacre of British officers and their families, in control of a fort with an army numbering over 10,000, who could attack him from behind as he moved towards Tatya Tope. He couldn't afford that risk. Rose demanded that the Rani surrender the city and the fortress. The time for procrastination was finally over. The Rani needed to make a decision. Acquiesce to the British demands and hope for fair treatment both for herself and for her stepson, or join the revolt against them. The Rani finally declared her hand. She sent a defiant message to General Rose. She would not surrender her fort to the British, and she would fight for independence. On the 23rd of March, Rose surrounded the walled city, and the following day his artillery commenced their bombardment. Almost immediately, they were met by counterfire from the Rani's cannon in the fort, and at one point the British and Indians were actually matching each other shot for shot. General Rose noted in his diary his admiration for the strength of the defences of the city and the efficiency of the defenders. The Rani of Jhansi held out for over a week. She was in part aided by her old friend, Tatya Tope, who now advanced to relieve the city with an army of 20,000 men and 28 guns. Rose, with less than 4,000 men, was caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. If he abandoned the siege to take on Tope, then the Rani could either attack him in the rear or flee the city with her army and conduct a guerrilla campaign, something akin to the Boer commandos in South Africa 40 years later. He decided to divide his force, keeping 2,000 at the siege and taking a mere 1,500 against Tope's advancing army. It was a heck of a risk, 1,500 versus 20,000. Rose and Tatya Tope's armies met at the Battle of Betwa on the 1st of April, 1858. Despite his overwhelming numbers, Tope didn't make them count. Dividing his force into an attacking party and a reserve, he then positioned his reserve too far back to effectively support the attacking column when it ran into trouble. And as that attacking column fell back, it became a rout, the rebels losing over 1,500 men and 18 of their guns. Tope was only able to extract his army by setting the surrounding jungle on fire, and then in almost like nightmare scenes, the British cavalry charged through the flames to pursue the Indian rebels. With the defeat at Betwa, the writing was on the wall for the defenders of Jhansi. The following day, the British artillery finally breached the city walls, and on the 3rd of April, Rose launched 4 assault columns on the city. They were met by fanatical resistance, which lasted all day. Through the city, no quarter was given by either side. It's estimated that 5,000 Indians, defenders and civilians alike, were killed that day. One person who did somehow survive the carnage was Mrs. Mutzlow and her son, who had been hiding in the city ever since the massacre back in June. It would have been somewhat ironic if, having survived that long, they'd been killed by one of their erstwhile liberators. At one point, the British faced a counterattack led by the Rani herself. Wearing a breastplate and wielding both a revolver and a sword, she led her Afghan bodyguard in an attack which drove the British back, but not out of the city. Her attack spent, the Rani fell back on the mighty fortress. That night, it became inevitable that the fortress itself would fall. Surrounded by her bodyguard, the Rani mounted her horse and, carrying her son, she made her escape. Legend has it that her horse jumped from the high walls of the fortress but was killed by the fall. Legend, truth, be that as it may, when the British finally secured the fort, General Rose realised that the Rani had got away. He immediately ordered the 14th Light Dragoons after her, and finally, after a 20-mile chase, they caught up with her party. In the ensuing gunfight, the Rani and her son once more were able to escape. The dragoons' horses were spent after that long initial chase, and the Rani fled to Kalpi. There, she joined the army of Tatya Tope and Raoul Saab, a nephew of Nana Saab, who appeared in my episode about the Cawnpore Massacre. Within a month, the Rani was once again leading an army against General Rose. This time, she was fighting alongside Tatya Tope at the Battle of Kunch. As they drew up their lines, the Rani urged Tope to protect his flanks against British attack. Her old friend ignored her advice, and General Rose duly attacked them on their unguarded flank, defeating them. Later that month, on the 22nd of May, she was fighting another battle, this time alongside Raoul Saab at Kalpi. Once more, her tactical advice was ignored by her male compatriot. The Rani tried to retrieve the situation by personally leading a mounted charge against the British, driving them back towards their guns. In that moment of potential victory for the Rani, General Rose arrived in person with reinforcements and drove her attack off. With 3 defeats on the trot, you might think this was the end of the Rani of Jhansi and the revolt in central India. Well, you're wrong. Combining what remained of their armies, the Rani, along with the Tatya Tope, Raoul Saab and the Nawab of Banda, advanced on the city of Gwalior. The state's ruler was pro-British and sent his 8,000-strong army out to confront them. Twice the size of the rebel army, the result should never have been in doubt. Except, as the two sides lined up, the Gwalior troops started fraternising with the rebels. And with that, an enlarged army of 13,000 entered the city on the 1st of June, without a shot being fired. It was a remarkable turnaround, and it also shows the slightly chaotic nature of this revolt in India. 2 days later, Raoul Saab proclaimed himself to be the viceroy of his uncle, Nana Saab, and organised a grand durbar, sort of like a coronation festivity, to mark the occasion. Hundreds were invited to the festivities. There was one notable absentee, the Rani of Jhansi. She argued they should be preparing their army to fight the British, not parting like the British had already fled India. And she was right. While Raoul Saab partied, General Rose was coming on like a steam train. 2 weeks after the fun of the Durbar, Rose arrived at the gates of the city and was joined by 2 further British columns. On the 17th of June, outside the city, the Rani was once more leading her troops from the front. Dressed as a cavalry leader in red jacket, red trousers and white puggaree, basically a turban cum headband, she led her troops in an attack on the advancing British 95th Regiment of Foot, later the Sherwood Foresters. With the 95th hard pressed, they were relieved by a charge by the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars under Captain Clement Heneage. This cavalry unit had formed part of the 3rd wave at the charge of the Light Brigade during the recent Crimean War. Now they charged through the attacking Indians, driving them back into their own camp. At some stage during this wild clash, the Rani received a sabre cut and fell from her horse. As the Hussars trotted back through the camp, the injured Rani raised her revolver to shoot at her attackers. But one of the Hussars shot her and continued on his way, totally oblivious to the fact that he had one of the rebellion's greatest leaders within his grasp. The mortally wounded Rani Lakshmibai was found by local villagers, who, sworn to secrecy, cremated her after she drew her last breath. She was just 29. General Rose went on to storm the city on the 19th of June and captured it after 5.5 hours of fighting. The defeat at Gwalior was the last hurrah for the rebellion. With Delhi, Cawnpore and Lucknow recaptured, the war had firmly turned against the rebels. The last pockets of resistance were wiped out, both Tatya Tope and Raoul Saab were captured and executed, and by July 1859 the British Governor-General had declared a state of peace. The revolt was over. The British remained in control, and any hopes Indians had of the British leaving India would have to wait nearly 90 years. And yet, in one respect, the rebellion had changed things in India forever. The revolt had made the British government sit up and realise that the East India Company, established back in 1600, was no longer fit for purpose. In August 1858, just 6 weeks after the death of the Rani of Jhansi, the India Bill was given royal assent, and with it, the British government took over the running of India from the East India Company. The revolt had taught the British a salutary lesson, and shaped future British-Indian relationships. The atrocities committed against British civilians numerically were far, far fewer than those dished out by the British on Indian civilians. But that memory of the massacres such as Cawnpore and at Jhansi would influence how many British treated Indians going forward. It created a barrier that was rarely broken and which was arguably more racial than in the past. The reprisals carried out by the British also influenced the future. Coming down hard can often seem justified at the time, but it invariably leads to bitterness and long-lasting memories. Just ask the Irish. The revolt may have failed, but for many Indians it was a watershed. British rule was not, in their eyes, justified, compassionate, or definite. It inspired the desire for independence, and that struggle would require an organised, cohesive leadership which had not been on display in the revolt. They would also look for heroes to inspire them, and no one could be more inspiring than the 29-year-old Rani Lakshmibai, the warrior queen of Jhansi. India's own Joan of Arc, or Boudica, but unlike the French heroine, she wasn't captured and executed by her enemies. And unlike the ancient Britain, she did not commit suicide rather than be taken to Rome in chains. The Rani of Jhansi died leading her troops into battle. No wonder even some British at the time admired her, despite her possible links to the massacre. And no wonder that to many she is a true Indian hero. The Rani of Jhansi, 1828 to 1858. Well, thanks for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed that story. That is the last in this particular series on the Indian Revolt. I know there are many other stories from the war to tell, and I will come back to them in the future. For instance, I'll talk about Frederick Roberts, remember from the episode on the Siege of Delhi, who was awarded a Victoria Cross during the Rising, and whose son would also receive Britain's highest medal for valour during the Boer War. They are one of only 3 father-son Victoria Cross recipients, and I intend to tell their stories very soon. These include Charles Gough, the brother of Hugh Gough, the officer who warned about the planned mutiny at Meerut in my opening episode. Both brothers were among the 182 men who received the VC during the Indian Rebellion. And Charles's son would later be awarded the Victoria Cross in British Somaliland, fighting the so-called Mad Mullah. So plenty of stories still to come, but in the meantime, thanks for your support, keep well, and I look forward to joining you again very soon.